This is Pastor Nathan. Welcome to the Sitting With It podcast. Each week I sit down with someone from my congregation to discuss the past Sunday's sermon. I hope this helps all of us to go deeper with the sermon, thinking about it, digesting it, and living it out in our lives. Let's get into it. So last week I didn't do the podcast because I didn't have anyone to join me. And so this week I've invited Nan to kind of reflect on both sermons because they actually tied in with each other. So 2 weeks ago on November 3rd, we looked at humility, which Paul's been talking about, and specifically what does humility look like? So what are the things and kind of what are the things that humility looks like? And then this week, the 10th, we got into a little bit more like who does humility look like? Specific people that the Philippians would have known that actually lived out this life of Jesus that Paul's been talking about. And then we got into kind of modern days, well, some more modern day stories than the Philippians, and then all the way up to modern day. So as you listen to both of these sermons, as you've been reflecting on them or thinking about them, what are some of the main takeaways for you or things that have stood out to you?
The main takeaway that I got from, which has been going on for weeks, is the word humility. And there's a simple definition for it, and it's easy, but to try to live a humble life and to try to live with humility that's the tough part. So I started out by, as I was thinking about this during the week, I wanted to look at a definition of humility as it pertains to the Bible. So humility is the practice of meekness, of obedience to God, and respect of self and others, submissiveness, putting each other's needs before their own. So I wanted to start out with a basic, it's really pretty simple, but when you come down to daily life and daily living, I have to remind myself all the time, rather than just jumping to a conclusion or reacting, what would Jesus say? Like, what would Jesus do, and how would Jesus feel if this happened to him? The way it all tied together for me was during the opening prayer of the service on Sunday. Katie said, it was on the Keeping It Real. The prayer was how quick we are to rely on ourselves and how slow we are to turn to you. And it's real easy for me in my life, hey, I'm independent, I have all my ducks in a row, I'm organized, I know what I want to do. But then every once in a while, something comes into your life that you don't have control over, and they're not your ducks in a row. And it's easy to deal with it. It's easy to lash out. It's easy to become frustrated. It's easy to say, hey, this isn't what I wanted. This isn't what I want in my life. This isn't the way I wanted it to work. And I find myself more and more, because of these sermons, turning around and saying, okay, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus say? But first I have to think, well, how would Jesus feel? Like, even if he saw me reacting like this. So it really hit home that I can put this into place every day in so many instances in my life. It just talk about keeping it real. It keeps it real. So Paul challenges us to consider our responses. So, we can be frustrated, we can be angry, or acceptance. And that's hard for me. I mean, I worked in a position for almost 30 years where I was in charge, I was in control, I told everybody what to do. And now I find myself, it wasn't easy. It's not easy to relinquish that. It's not easy to relinquish control, and humility has an awful lot to do with power. And humility also, I think we have to pull into and talk about false humility too, because that was also part of the sermon where there's a critical message about guarding against religious pride, hypocrisy. Paul warns of Christians who misuse religion for power. And I started thinking, I was talking to a friend a while back and said something about, I do the thing where within 5 minutes of meeting people now, I tell them, yeah, I go to Swamp Mennonite and, why don't you stop by? And, this is what our community is like. And here's the website. And I never thought I'd be the kind of person who did that. I didn't think I had it in me, honestly, because of my family and the way my family is. So I find with my family, the way I deal with it is I can't preach to them, I can't convince them, but I can live. And if I live the right way and they see it every day and they hear me every day, then maybe I can plant the seed and maybe maybe something's gonna take root. But I turned to my friend and I said, she said, how many millions of people died because of religion? And I looked right at her and I said, you know what? Tell me one time, like wars over religion. I said, guess what? The Crusades, the wars in Europe in the 16th, 17th, early 18th century, back to the Roman days, they weren't about religion. They were about power. And power is false humility. Power is where you use religion to say, our God is this, and you have false gods, and that's false humility. And she just looked at me, and I never thought of that. I never thought of it that way. So,
yep. Yeah, something I've thought about is like the Protestant Reformation, right, happen at the same time that Europe was breaking away from the crumbling Roman Empire. And the reality is, like, would we have Protestantism if it wasn't for nation states who adopted it as their religion? But were they doing that for religious purposes, or were they actually doing that for the power and control it gave them over their people, separate from the power of the Pope and everything that was connected with that within Roman Catholicism?
And a lot of it was status, right? So I kind of put it together with, it all started on the sermon before that, on the 3rd. And I started thinking about, like, Jesus sends us messages. The Spirit moves us, and there are things you see and things you do and things you hear that move you, and it's all good. But sometimes you get a lesson in humility that you were never expecting. And that was where it hit me, because sometime early in 2010, I was diagnosed as stage 3B lung cancer. And at the time, in 2010, stage 4 was, you're done. There's no, it's progressive, and they can do more now than they could back then. So I got my diagnosis, and it hit me like, I was in shock. How can this be? Like, I have my life. I have everything I want. Like, everything's all, I worked so hard for this my whole life. What do you mean I have lung cancer? What do you, how can this be? And for me, having been so independent my entire life, like, I change the oil on my car. I change the spark plugs on my mower. Like, I do everything myself. And it's so hard for me to ask for help. And as I started going through my treatments, I had weeks and weeks of chemo, of radiation, and I needed people. I needed people to come and sit in the doctor's office with me. At one point, I was in a wheelchair because I'd lost so much weight and was so weak. Like, I couldn't walk. I couldn't breathe right. Probably half of it was anxiety, but for the first time in many, many years since I was a child, I all of a sudden had to start asking people for help. And I, to this day, can't get over, like, the support that I got from friends, from neighbors, from family, and what a lesson in humility, because I never expected, it was a diagnosis that came out of the blue, but it was a lesson. And the lesson was, it's not, I think sometimes it's easy to mistake humility for weakness, right? The humble and the meek, they're weak, but It's not. It's not. It opens up a whole other side of life that, there are other people who care. There are other people who think and want to help. And it's not like, I never looked at it as a burden when someone asked me for help. So now I realize, like, if I ask someone for help, it's not a burden.
Yeah.
But I was kind of brought up, like, don't be weak. You have to be strong. Don't cry. Don't, you know what I mean? Do your own thing. So it kind of went against so many things that were in my psyche for so many years. To have that one experience just completely change my mindset. That diagnosis completely changed my outlook on life and my mindset. I'm a different person because of that.
Yeah.
And like, how sad. I needed that. But you know what? Sometimes you need someone to knock you on the side of the head and say, hey, guess what? This is like, turn around and look at what you're doing. Look at how you're living. Look at how you're thinking.
Yeah.
And sometimes we need a bigger push than others.
Yeah.
And at other times, like, sometimes I need a good swift kick, and God gave me that. And he opened my eyes.
Yeah. Well, and I think kind of what you're saying too is, like, humility doesn't come naturally to us. And like, we naturally, I mean, I am raising 3 kids, right? And so when you have a toddler, they're not thinking about others' needs. They're thinking of their own needs. And that's as it should be, right? In some ways, as a toddler, you're not at a place to be taking care of others, but like, humility doesn't come naturally. And then in our American culture, we actually elevate people who push and pull themselves up by their bootstraps and do what they need to get it done. And so then this Christian idea of humility, I actually was listened to something recently on humility where they said in the early church, it was a defining value of or virtue of Christians, because in the Roman Empire, humility was not a virtue. It was considered weakness. It was considered a bad thing. And these Christians were doing something very different. Like, it looked different. It felt different. And then actually just today, I hadn't thought of this till you were talking, but I read an article today that there is a hockey player, I think in the NHL, but from Canada, who was just suspended for a number of games for calling, in the midst of a fight, calling another player a Mennonite, because they grew up Mennonite, but it was considered a religious slur that they referred to them as a Mennonite. But the way they used the word was essentially like, well, you're too weak to be fighting in a hockey game because you're Mennonite. And so it's interesting thinking about, like, for Mennonites, humility has been a core value of the faith for 500 years. But I would say for me growing up in the Mennonite context, sometimes that humility was a false humility, not in the direction of like power and control necessarily, but in the direction of sometimes people were afraid to actually actually acknowledge what they had done well. And so there was this idea of like, well, I can't acknowledge that I do anything well. I have to almost minimize myself. And so humility became, rather than about acknowledging others, lifting others up, and honoring others, it became about nobody can be honored. And we all just kind of status quo, we all fit in together. So I wonder for you didn't grow up in a Mennonite context. What has it been like entering into this church, thinking about humility? And obviously some of this was stuff you were thinking about even before being here, but maybe what things have changed for you, what things have stayed the same? Yeah.
You know what was really hard? So I grew up in mainly Irish and Italian families. I mean, there's some Nordic stuff there, but I mean, it's constant battling. And the whole concept of non-resistance, like what, that's like a total 360 from the way my family lived. I mean, my aunts and uncles, they all fought like cats and dogs. They all loved each other, and we were all, a big family, but non-resistance was like, wow, like how that was a tough thing for me to wrap my head around. And a lot of people, I think it's tough because some people take non-resistance and humility, like we said before, meekness, they look at it as a weakness, but it really isn't. I mean, once you start living it, like I know if I see it in other people, I'm really impressed by it. Like it strikes me and I see it and I'm like, oh, they're biting their tongue and I was brought up, no, you speak your mind, we're very thick-skinned people. We don't, it's almost impossible to insult me. And I grew up like that, but that toughness and that it was hard. The resistance thing was really a big concept for me to kind of say, okay, it's okay to not jump to a conclusion. It's okay to not take action. It's okay because I was in work I had to be I was type A personality to the max. That's how we were so successful. And that was a big thing. That was a tough change for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I wonder, like, what does that, like, if somewhere in between a culture that's built around power and control and do everything that you can to get your way, but on the other hand, a culture that I think would equally be not really who Jesus is, that it's just, you're just a doormat. You don't stand up for yourself at all. You don't recognize any of your own accomplishments.
There's a happy medium.
Yeah. Like,
There's
what does that look like?
In the middle that says, I think one of the best slogans is pick your battles, right? So you don't want to fight. And you don't want to fight all the time. But, you do have to make a stand against certain things. I mean, if you see wrong, I mean, we can't continue to just, you can't turn your head and pretend, oh, I don't see that. I don't hear that. I don't know that. I mean, sometimes you have to step in. But I think the key to that is you need to pick your battles. And for me, I lived my whole life was a battle against everything and everybody. I mean, I worked in a place that was 99% male. It was a male-dominated company. And for me, I had to be tough and strong and battle every day. But I mean, I look at my life now and I hope that I'm living it in a way that, my family and my friends and people around me see it and would want to emulate it. Like, I hope I'm a good messenger because I don't go to people and preach, and I don't, but to me, like, my actions have to speak louder than my words.
Yeah.
And that's how I've changed.
Yeah. Well, what else did you notice from the sermon, the sermons, either one of them? What are the other things you've been thinking about?
The humility. I mean, the word submissive to me was always a bad word. Like, what do you mean submissive? I'm not going to be submissive to anyone. And I always understood the concept of submissiveness to God, but submissiveness to my neighbors and my church family and my friends. And it's like, oh, now I get it. So that kind of comes into play too, that, okay, you know what? So, yeah, let's just go with the flow on this one. And you alluded to it, and I forget where it was. It was something I had read, when you talked about, I mean, sometimes we make decisions, I mean, even with the board, that not everyone's going to be happy with every decision we make every time. But for the cause of the greater good, sometimes you just need to say, okay. I mean, how many people do we have in this congregation? If we do a survey and 98% of the people say this is what I think we need to do, then if we really disagree with that, maybe we need to examine our motives. Like, okay, why do I feel differently from that 98%? Like, the majority really usually, we have a bunch of good heads on our shoulders here, and we have a lot of intelligent people that are successful. And so if I'm going to disagree with 98% of the people, maybe sometimes I need to look in the mirror. And there's another lesson in humility.
Yeah.
So there's opportunities throughout the day, every single day, to say, oh yeah, the humility thing. And it's kind of cool because it resounds. And it's every day now, and I see it in so many instances, just little stupid examples in my life. And I think of the humility sermon and think about the description of humility, and it helps, makes it a little easier for me.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I found, like, for me too, I mentioned last time on the podcast with Tracy about, like, me thinking more about how am I applying this in my own life. But as a pastor, I'm spending so much time reading scripture, studying things, and preparing messages that there's seasons where it really is hitting home for me, and there's seasons it's not, right? There's times it's like, I think this is what needs to be said, but it doesn't feel like it's for me. But I've had the same experience with this humility series where I find like I'm thinking about it all the time. Especially, I would say, I'm maybe in a similar spot to where you were at a previous point in your life where like I'm in charge of a lot of things. I'm a key leader in a lot of different areas. And thinking about like, how am I humble with my kids, right? I oftentimes expect them to submit to me. What does it mean for me to submit to them? Or how am I humble in how I run my business? Or, I mean, as a key leader here at church, like what does that look like to actually live out when you have power, but you're also called to be humble, right? Which
but
is what
it's
Jesus
definitely, it's a conundrum because in order to be successful in any of these things that you just spoke about, your family, the church life, your life as a pastor, in order to be successful, you need confidence. And confidence and humility are kind of on opposite ends of the scale. So to pull it into the middle it's tough, but you're not going to be successful if you're not confident.
Right.
So,
but I think what we
it's a
see
paradox.
in Jesus, right, is Jesus is confident, but he also lives this life of humility.
Yep, he did it. We can do it.
Yeah. So I wonder, as you've been thinking through some of these things, are there maybe questions that have come up for you that you're like, how does that work? What does that mean? Or maybe things you've disagreed with that you're like, I don't know, that I'm not sure that really checks out.
I didn't disagree with anything. So I know another thing you said, like you tend to overthink, right? I'm not, like, to me, my faith is, if I had to put it in words, it's really pure and it's really simple. Like my faith, like when we were babies laying in a crib, Mom would like bless us and say the Our Father and the Hail Mary, and like as soon as we could talk, like it was something that it didn't come to me when I was 10 or 12 or 15 that it finally dawned on me that, it's almost like I was born into this. Like I knew Jesus from the time I was a baby. So I don't overthink and I don't make things complicated. I think our world is so complicated to begin with. So whenever I have the opportunity to kind of simplify it, but it works well for me because my religion and my beliefs they're basic, they're simple, they're very black and white, which I guess could be good and could be bad. But for me, I don't see gray areas. I mean, I look at the Bible says this or the Bible doesn't say this. It's right or it's wrong. And I don't fall into that, and which I think can be a trap sometimes. But for me, just keeping it simple, humility, it's simple. Yeah. It's an easy concept. We can make it complicated. And I don't think it really is. Yeah. I think you just need to believe, and you need to, like, something just needs to click in your brain that says, hey, this is the way I want to be. This is who I want to be remembered as. This is what I want people to think of me as. And this is how I want to live. Yeah. It is, to me, very simple. It's not real complicated.
Yep. You're a better Mennonite than I am. So for 300 years, our conference ended every annual assembly by asking the question of, do we still affirm the simple, non-resistant faith? And that was the idea of, hey, whatever we discussed, whatever was maybe important or the issues of the day, at the end of the day, this is what we hold to. We hold to the simple, non-resistant faith. And that's what you just described. And yeah, I do. I'm aware that I make things too complicated, and I don't want to. Like, I want things to be simple, so I'm always fighting myself trying to make it simple. And so I love that in you, that you're like, no, this is simple. It's clear. It's hard, but we do it. We live it out.
Yeah, we can make that. But it's also, I think, it's a personality, like you're born with. You're born with a personality, and you can work on it. And you can decide. Yeah, I'm not going to be like this. I'm not going to do that. But it just comes easy to me to just let's keep it all simple.
Yeah. So how are you applying it when you're thinking about humility? Like, what are some of those simple things that you see? Like, I'm going to work on this. I'm going to grow in this. I'm going to make a change here.
It basically, more than anything, like I said before, I was always really quick to like just jump on things and be a little bit more aggressive than I am now. And I kind of like pull myself back. And I mean, sometimes you don't need to hear my opinion. Sometimes my opinion is not really that important. So sometimes I can bite my tongue and not say anything. And that's okay. Because if my actions are speaking louder than my words anyway. I know one of the last questions, what did you want to be remembered for? And I hope that people don't remember me for who I was 20, 30 years ago. And I hope they remember me for who I am now. I hope they remember the me that has worked on humility. And I hope they remember the me that tries to put others before myself all the time. And I hope they remember that the me that just was always there for whenever anybody needed me.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I think that's what all of us can hope for, right? That we've actually grown throughout our life, and that people remember the areas we've grown in, the ways that we've become more like Jesus. And I know, at least for me, you are an example of what it looks like to live for Jesus. And I'm always blown away by how new you are. You've had faith as a part of your life in a lot of ways for a long time, but in terms of the actual structure of religion, like it's a newer thing for you to be exploring.
It's absolutely new, because with what I was born into, it was extremely structured. It was very, very ritual. There was a lot of rote. There was a lot of memorization. You know, I used to be able to do the whole Mass, and I knew all the Latin words, and we sung in the choir, and everything was Latin. But it didn't resonate. I didn't feel it. It was just very ceremonial, I think would be the best way to put it.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that this church actually lives the teachings of Christ. Like, they don't just spout them and have us repeat it. And it's real. It's a lifestyle.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I love your example in that. The next passage here, what I'm studying for this coming Sunday, is Paul says, follow my example. And then he says, live like people who are living the way that I am. And if I was to think about who I would put in that category of people that I hope I become more like, you would be somebody in that category. And to me, it speaks to you and your character, but it speaks to Jesus, right? The transformation that you're talking about, that you've experienced in your own life. When people say, like, well, I don't know if God's real. I don't know if the Holy Spirit, like this whole Holy Spirit coming in and transforming us and doing a work in our heart. And I think you're a example of what Jesus does.
It can be. So I think I said this when I was baptized. Like, I always wanted to wake up one night and see chariots and angels and hear trumpets blasting. But the Spirit can come quietly and softly, and slowly and peacefully, and it kind of can creep up on you when you don't know what's happening, and it can happen in different ways for different people.
Yeah.
And even though I always wanted the trumpets blaring, and someone looked at me once and said, you know what? God didn't give you that because you didn't need that. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, oh, okay. But yeah, sometimes the Spirit can be soft and simple.
Yep. Yeah. Well, thanks for joining me this week. Thanks for all your time thinking about this topic and putting things together for it. And I'm sure it'll be meaningful for those that listen.
Thank you.